Picture this. You're designing a battlefield for an upcoming set piece in your tabletop RPG, and it just doesn't call for a whole lot of interesting battlefield design. What's the easiest way to make an empty battlefield interesting? The question is subjective, but the answer is scatter terrain. And what's the easiest type of scatter terrain to make? The objective answer is rocks. But you can't just grab some rocks off the side of the road, so let's try our hand at making some scatter terrain ourselves. I'm Chris, welcome to Tabletop Endeavors. In today's video, we're going to make some rocks with a focus on grid-based games like Dungeons & Dragons. But the technique we're going to use today can be used for any game like Warhammer 40k. Now, saying rocks is a bit of a simplification. Mechanically, I'll be making two types of terrain. That's going to be obstructing terrain and difficult terrain. The terms may vary between different game systems, but they're mostly going to be the same sort of thing. For convenience, here's a list of all the tools and materials I'll be using in today's video. I'll go into detail for each given material as it gets used. One thing I do want to note before starting is scale. When I craft pieces for a grid-based game such as Dungeons & Dragons, I use 1¼ inch grids, or roughly 32 millimeters. I use this scale because I find the traditional 1-inch grid to be a little cramped and it forces miniatures into fairly compromising positions. Now, there's nothing stopping you from using a 1-inch scale, or any scale really that you want, especially if you're integrating with existing terrain. For simplicity, I'm just going to refer to these measurements by units unless I need to be more specific. Before we jump into the meat of cutting our stones out, we need something for them to sit on. This will keep the boulders we make from rolling around, giving us more freedom as we decorate, and helping us to maintain a consistent style across not just today's pieces, but future projects as well. I'm using plastic card as it's sturdy, thin, and easy to work with, and generally useful for modeling. You can use cardstock, particle board, or any other material you might already have on hand, just make sure it's rigid. No more than 1 millimeter or 2 thick, and doesn't spontaneously dematerialize in the presence of moisture. Using a square, let's measure out our bases for cutting. I decided on a handful of tiles in varying sizes, the exact measurements of which I'll put on the screen now. A rotary paper trimmer like the one I'm using can trivialize the task of cutting, but a box cutter or hobby knife with a guide will work just fine. Plastic card is neat in that you don't have to cut all the way through. Once it's been scored, you can just apply a little pressure and get a nice snap. Now, I'm not a fan of these pointy corners, so I'm going to round them out with some scissors, following up with a file to smooth it all out. This leaves some substantial plastic dust though, so it's good to hit your workspace with a quick vacuuming. A mask might also not be the worst idea either. Let's set those to the side now and carve our stones. For this, I'm using XPS foam, also known as foam board insulation. It's easy to cut and it takes texture really well. You can use packaging foam as well, but its bubbly texture is prominent and its bouncy structure is going to resist any texture you try to apply to it. I used it in one of my first real terrain projects and I regret the decision. Let's measure out a few blocks and cut them out. A Proxxon hot cutter works perfectly for this, but for such a small project, I opted to use just a box cutter, exposing only as much of the blade as necessary for making multiple, gentle passes. You'll notice I cut out fewer stones than bases. I'm going to leave a few of our bases for difficult terrain, more on that later. Next, we'll shape the cubes into something more natural. I started with a hot cutter thinking how easy it was going to be to get the rough shapes. But this box cutter burns with the heat of 1,000 suns and melted the foam into an undesirable texture. Thankfully, a hobby knife or utility knife has no issue here, and at this scale the precision is probably what we want anyways. For some realism, we'll want to add a few concave cuts as well, since boulders are almost never strictly convex. That's to say, we want to carve out some depressions by making a few cuts with the points of our blade facing some imaginary point within the foam. These cuts are going to often be parallel, but not always. Some of them will be shallow, others we want to make a little more shelf-like. Using variation is going to make sure that we get something more natural looking. Next, let's add some narrow cuts into the faces, keeping them spaced out and roughly parallel with each other. These can represent things like weathering or layer lines or markings from excavations. I even went as far as to split this boulder entirely. This gives it the impression of having been completely fractured, and by making a 5 to 10 degree cut on the base, it really emphasizes that. All that's left is to add some texture using a tool that no terrain crafter should be without: the aluminum foil ball. We'll be rolling this ball over every surface to give it a bit of a chaotic look. You can change the resultant texture by varying how tightly you pack the ball and with how much force you use. For a more weathered look, really hit those edges, or avoid them like I did on the split boulder to give it the impression that it's a more recent fracture. Once we're happy with the texture, we can move on to basing. To attach the stones to their bases, we'll score the plastic card. This is the process of cutting the surface repeatedly to give adhesive something to grip to, strengthening the bond. We don't really need to do this with the foam though, because it's already quite porous and will absorb the PVA or whatever glue you're using just fine. Then we'll apply some undiluted glue with a brush. I'm using Mod Podge, but any PVA will work. With the glue applied, gently press the foam into the board and hold it in place for just a few seconds to let it settle, then set it aside to dry. With all the boulders based, I decided to take a few foam shavings from earlier and attach it to some of the bases we reserved for the rough terrain. This will work nicely as stones kind of poking out from the earth. After about an hour, the glue will have had enough time to dry and we can add some texture. For my convenience, I'm using ground texture from Vallejo that I already had on hand anyways, but for my next large project I intend to experiment with some more cost-effective measures. Now's the time to drop any texture recipes you may have down in the comments. Doesn't take much to get the desired effect, so I'm spreading it fairly thin using this paste applicator. Once we have full coverage, we'll add some pebble patches to the still wet paste, followed by a little bit of sand, pressing it all gently into the paste to help secure it. Another way we can add a little texture and detail and dirty up the stones a bit is by adding pebbles and sand into some of the cracks in the stones. The best way I know to get a good supply of sand and small pebbles is to go to your local hardware store or garden center and just pick up a pack of play sand. After a little bit of sifting, you'll have all the tiny pebbles and sand you'll ever need. With that done, it's time to find something else to do, because we aren't doing anything else until this paste cures. Normally before priming foam, you'll want to seal it as the propellants and spray primers can melt foam. My go-to is to use a mix of Mod Podge and black paint. I chose instead to experiment. The insulation foam has a dense structure that isn't as prone to melting, so I decided to see what spraying it with Citadel Gray Cere would do for the texture. And I was rewarded. It ended up producing a slightly porous texture that I think actually lends itself really well to the stone. That said, the primer coverage isn't perfect. But we have several layers of paint ahead of us, so I'm not too worried at this point. Time to break out some brushes. The first thing we'll do is add a few undertones using some cheap acrylic craft paints. I'm starting with this warm green, meant to emphasize growth like mildew or moss, spattering it on where I think moisture might collect. Then I added some tan just to provide a bit of variety to the stone's color, stippling it onto some of the bare spots. While these colors are bold right now, the next few steps are going to tone them down. We've entered the trust the process zone. I'm all about experimentation, so don't hesitate to try out some weird and odd colors. You never know how it's going to turn out. For the dirt, I chose a reddish brown. If I had planned better, I would have done this before the stone's undertones and painted some of those pebbles along with the undertones. But I didn't. You still have this choice though. Do it. Now we can hit the rocks with our base color. The brown and green are adding a lot of warmth, so I'm using a cooler gray, watered down to a roughly 2:1 ratio of water to paint. When you first apply the paint, it's going to look like it completely covers the undertone. But as the paint dries, the colors will start to show through again. If you're worried about this, you can always thin your paint a little further and apply more coats. Just don't go as far as to create a wash.
Now is also the time to go back over all the pebbles and paint them in our base color, though you could hit them with other more exotic colors first, as I mentioned previously.
Once it's dry, it's time for a little shading. We can create a simple wash using brown paint at our base, then add a much smaller portion of black paint. It doesn't take much black to darken our wash, and it's easier to make it darker than it is to line it back up, so go a little at a time and experiment. I also added a spot of green just to add a little more character to the hue, but it's totally optional. Once we're happy with our color, we'll water it down with a ratio of at least 5 parts water for each part of paint. Though you may want to go even thinner. I've seen others use a drop of dish soap to increase flow, but I used the wash as is. I experimented with a dropper for application, but wasn't really happy with the flow. The easy fix is to just grab a shade brush, dip it in a little bit of water, and spread the wash as needed. The dropper still proved useful for filling cracks with more concentrated wash, but the brush did the bulk of the work here.
And let's not forget to get the wash on the ground texture as well.
Once everything's been covered in wash, it's once again time to watch paint dry. After engaging in some other hobby for a bit, we can come back and make these rocks pop with a little highlighting using the dry brush technique. For this, I used a large dry brush from Army Painter and a cream colored paint. Rarely do you want to go with straight white. Makeup brushes also work quite well for this. We start by getting a small amount of paint onto our brush, then rub it into a paper towel, making sure to work that paint into the bristles. Then we'll test on a clean patch of the paper towel, rubbing it in until almost no paint is coming off the brush. Finally, we'll start using gentle strokes across the surface of our rocks. The bumps and edges are going to catch the bristles, giving us a subtle highlight that brings out the texture of the stone. If you're not getting a strong enough highlight from this, you can always either use a little more pressure or apply more paint to the brush and rub it in again. Repeat on the bases, being careful not to knock any of the pebbles off with the brush's ferrule. The dry brush really pops up the contrast, which I found to be too intense on the ground. To fix this, we can make a quick wash using our base brown, about 4 parts of water to part paint, and cover all the dirt, trying to avoid the pebbles this time around. We can also use this wash on the side of the stones, just to kind of dirty up the base of those rocks. For this, we'll just use a few scattered patches and stippling. Once that dries, we're left with a more pleasant contrast and stronger differentiation between the stone and the ground. Now at this point we could call the scatter terrain done. And in fact, I actually ran my game using it at this stage. But I always like to add a little bit of vegetation, and I came back to this after my session of D&D to finish up the job. Let's start with some blended turf. To apply it, we'll use a brush to apply some watered down glue to the dirt, using a 2-to-1 ratio of water to Mod Podge in my case. Then we just need to sprinkle turf around the stone onto the base, using a container to catch the excess. If we get turf where we don't want it, like the side of the stone, all we have to do is use a clean brush to push it off. Once the glue is dry, we can start adding tufts. I used a mix of small flowering grass tufts for this project. These already have an adhesive on their bottom, but I find it's never strong enough to hold them in place for long. So some undiluted PVA glue isn't a bad idea. Just use some tweezers to extract the tufts from their paper, dip the bottom into the glue, and then press it into place. The gaps between pebbles and around the edge of the stone are usually great spots to decorate. It's little details like this that will go a long way towards enhancing the look of any project. Just make sure to consider how it affects the usability. Since I intended for minis to actually stand on top of this terrain, I've limited myself to very short tufts, but for display pieces, I'll likely want larger tufts or even more diverse vegetation. Once everything's in place, the last optional step is to use a matte spray varnish. This will help lock everything into place and will greatly improve the durability of the piece. And there we have it, a small collection of scattered terrain that you can use in just about any of your tabletop games. These will work great in a number of environments, including plains, highlands, forests, and they have endless reusability. The best part is the whole project is really affordable and can be knocked out in less than an afternoon, though if you're willing to spend extra time during the carving and detailing steps, you can get something particularly special. I hope you've enjoyed today's video, maybe learned something, but if not, at least enjoyed seeing how someone else creates what they create. If you enjoyed this and you want to find me elsewhere, you can find me on Blue Sky at the handle Tabletop Endeavors. I also have a link tree that is never out of date where you can find all the other places I am, including Buy Me a Coffee and Ko-Fi. Though, if you want to support me, I am going to ask you to think a little bit if there's a charity you should be putting money towards instead. That's it for today. Have a great one, and I hope to see you in the next endeavor.